He was told his resume was a liability and was unceremoniously shown the door. But when a multi-billion-dollar cyber crisis plunged Sterling Enterprises into chaos, the desperate single dad didn't just walk away. In 60 seconds, he bypassed their entire security grid and saved the empire. Here is how it happened. Arthur Pendleton adjusted the collar of his suit, ignoring the fraying threads at the cuffs. It was a charcoal two-piece he had bought at a thrift store 6 years ago, long before the hospital bills, long before his wife packed her bags in the middle of the night, and long before his life became a masterclass in survival. He sat in the aggressively sterile waiting room of Sterling Enterprises, a gleaming monolith of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. Arthur's hands, calloused and faintly scarred from late nights fixing hardware, were clasped tightly in his lap. Inside his scuffed leather briefcase was a resume that told two stories. To the untrained eye, it told the story of a failure, a man who had dropped out of the corporate tech race for 3 agonizing years. But to Arthur, it told the story of his daughter, Harper. Harper was 5. She had spent the last 3 years battling a rare, aggressive form of autoimmune hepatitis. The gap in his employment wasn't a vacation. It was a grueling marathon of chemotherapy wards, midnight fevers, and desperate freelance coding gigs done at 3 a.m. while she slept hooked up to monitors. Now, Harper was finally in remission, but the medical debt was a crushing mountain. Arthur needed this senior systems architect position. He needed the health insurance. He needed to be able to look his little girl in the eye and promise her they wouldn't lose their small, drafty apartment. "Mr. Pendleton?" A sharp voice broke his reverie. Arthur stood up, smoothing his jacket, and followed an impeccably dressed assistant into a corner office that smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Richard Hayes, the Vice President of Talent Acquisition. Richard was a man who looked like he had never missed a meal or a promotion in his life. He didn't bother to stand or offer his hand. Instead, he stared down at Arthur's resume with a look of profound distaste. "Have a seat, Arthur," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. He tapped a gold Mont Blanc pen against the paper. "I'll be honest. I only agreed to this interview because Benjamin Croft in IT flagged your early work at Cyphertech. But looking at this timeline, I'm deeply concerned." Arthur sat straight. "Mr. Hayes, my early work speaks for itself. I architected the core database structures for 3 Fortune 500 companies before I was 30. I am fully capable." "You have a 3-year gap," Richard interrupted, circling the blank space on the paper. "From 2023 to present. Nothing. A blank void in an industry that reinvents itself every 6 months. You might as well have been in a coma, Arthur." Arthur swallowed his pride. "I was dealing with a severe family medical crisis. My daughter was critically ill. I stepped away from full-time corporate work to be her primary caregiver, but I kept my skills sharp. I took on independent, high-level freelance contracts under NDAs. I assure you, my understanding of your back-end systems is current." Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. His eyes swept over Arthur's faded suit, taking in the desperation Arthur was trying so hard to hide. "Sterling Enterprises is not a charity, Mr. Pendleton. We are a multi-billion-dollar data logistics firm. We need committed innovators who eat, sleep, and breathe the code. We don't have time to hold the hands of people who are rusty, distracted, or carrying personal baggage that interferes with their output." The words felt like a physical blow. Personal baggage. Harper fighting for her life was just a liability to this man. "I am not distracted," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, a quiet intensity burning in his eyes. "I am hungry. I will outwork any 25-year-old in this building because I have something real to lose." Richard sighed heavily, feigning exhaustion. He slid the resume across the desk, back toward Arthur. "We are in the middle of a major acquisition today, the Omnicorp merger. We need soldiers, not sob stories. I'm afraid your profile is simply a liability we cannot afford. You're dismissed, Arthur. Best of luck in your job hunt." Arthur sat frozen for a fraction of a second. The urge to yell, to explain, to beg, rose in his throat, but he choked it down. He had his dignity, even if he had nothing else. He took his resume, placed it carefully back into his battered briefcase, and stood up. "Thank you for your time," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. He walked out of the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, sealing his fate. As he walked down the long, carpeted hallway, the adrenaline faded, leaving only a hollow, sickening dread. How was he going to tell Harper? How was he going to pay the specialist next week? He felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders, threatening to snap his spine. He stepped into the elevator, hit the button for the lobby, and closed his eyes. The ground floor of Sterling Enterprises was an architectural marvel designed to intimidate. It was a massive atrium of white marble, indoor waterfalls, and a sprawling, glass-enclosed nerve center, a visual display of the company's tech dominance, where dozens of engineers monitored global data traffic on wall-sized screens. As Arthur stepped out of the elevator, he was planning his subway route home, already calculating how much he could get for pawning his grandfather's watch. But before he could take 10 steps toward the revolving exit doors, the ambient hum of the lobby was shattered by a piercing, mechanized siren. The soft blue lighting of the atrium suddenly snapped to a harsh, flashing crimson. Behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of the nerve center, absolute chaos erupted. Men and women in tailored suits and lab coats were practically sprinting across the room. The massive global data map on the main screen, which normally glowed with healthy green nodes, was rapidly bleeding red. Arthur stopped in his tracks, his trained eyes instantly drawn to the cascading strings of code flashing across the secondary monitors. Then, the elevator banks chimed simultaneously. A frantic entourage spilled out, led by a woman who commanded the room the second her heels hit the marble. It was Victoria Sterling. Even Arthur recognized her. The 42-year-old billionaire CEO was an icon of ruthless efficiency and visionary tech strategy. Today, however, her normally stoic face was pale with fury. She was flanked by an entourage of panicked executives, including a sweating, red-faced man Arthur recognized from industry magazines as Benjamin Croft, the chief technology officer. "What do you mean we are locked out?" Victoria's voice cut through the alarm klaxons, echoing in the lobby as she marched toward the glass doors of the nerve center. "It's a localized logic bomb. Victoria," Benjamin Croft stuttered, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. "Someone embedded it in the legacy framework. It triggered the exact second the Omnicorp wire transfer initiated. The system is isolating the mainframe to protect the data, but it's frozen the transfer. If we don't authenticate in the next 4 minutes, the Omnicorp deal defaults. We lose the acquisition and forfeit the $2 billion escrow." "Then bypass it," Victoria shouted, swiping her master keycard at the nerve center door. It flashed red. "Access denied. Why is my card not working?" "The system doesn't recognize anyone. It's reverted to a zero-trust lockdown." Benjamin panicked, tapping frantically on a tablet. "We have 20 engineers trying to brute force the firewall, but it's an old Unix-based architecture underneath our modern UI. The encryption is shifting too fast." Arthur stood 20 feet away, transfixed by the screens inside the glass room. He read the error codes, scrolling at a dizzying speed. Error 409, asynchronous decryption failure, protocol override, tangent actual, node 7 locked, node 8 locked. Arthur's breath hitched. Tangent actual. He knew that protocol. He didn't just know it. He wrote it. 4 years ago, during the darkest days of Harper's illness, Arthur had taken a desperate ghost contract for a third-party vendor called Apex Solutions. They had tasked him with building an unbreakable fail-safe loop for a massive corporate client. They never told him the client's name. They just paid him in untraceable cash, which kept Harper in the private ward. He had built a backdoor into the code, a master override designed solely in case the logic loop ever turned on its host. Sterling Enterprises was running his ghost code, and it was tearing them apart. 2 minutes! An engineer screamed from inside the glass room, communicating through the intercom. "The escrow is bleeding! We are losing $50 million a second in network penalties!" Victoria Sterling grabbed Benjamin Croft by the lapels of his expensive jacket. "You have 60 seconds to fix this, Ben, or I swear to God I will ruin you." Arthur didn't think. He didn't weigh the consequences, or remember the stinging rejection he had just suffered upstairs. The pure instinct of a master architect took over. He dropped his scuffed briefcase on the marble floor and sprinted toward the glass room. "Hey, back away!" a burly security guard yelled, stepping in front of Arthur. Arthur dodged him, slamming his shoulder into the heavy glass door of the nerve center. "The firewall isn't shifting!" Arthur yelled over the sirens, staring directly at Victoria Sterling. "It's a localized time dilation loop. Brute force will only make the encryption tighter. You're squeezing a Chinese finger trap." Victoria snapped her head toward him, her eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you? Get this guy out of here." Richard Hayes, the HR VP who had rejected Arthur moments ago, suddenly appeared from the stairwell, out of breath. "He's a rejected applicant! Security!" Two guards grabbed Arthur's arms, yanking him backward. "Listen to me!" Arthur roared, planting his feet, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who held the keys to the kingdom. "If you don't input the alphanumeric sequence for the Titan backdoor in the next 60 seconds, your mainframe will hard-wipe the Omnicorp data to protect it. You will lose the merger." Benjamin Croft stopped tapping on his tablet, his mouth falling open. "How do you know the project code name? Titan is heavily classified." "Because I built the damn failsafe," Arthur yelled, struggling against the guards. "Underneath your shiny UI, it's a Unix shell. Give me a terminal, I can stop it." "He's lying, Victoria!" Richard Hayes yelled. "He's a desperate nobody with a 3-year gap on his resume. Arrest him!" Victoria Sterling looked at the main screen. The countdown was at 45 seconds. She looked at her CTO, who was completely paralyzed by fear, and then looked into Arthur's eyes. She saw no panic, only absolute, razor-sharp certainty. "Let him go," Victoria commanded, her voice like cracking ice. "Victoria, you can't be serious," Richard started. "I said let him go," she barked. She swiped a physical emergency key on the keypad, overriding the door lock. The glass doors hissed open. "You have 40 seconds, stranger. If you break my company, I'll make sure you never see the sun again." Arthur shoved past the guards, bolted into the nerve center, and physically pushed a stunned engineer out of the main terminal chair. His hands hit the keyboard. Suddenly, Arthur wasn't a desperate, broke single father anymore. He was the maestro. His fingers flew across the mechanical keys in a blur. He didn't bother with the graphical interface. He killed it instantly, dropping the massive screen into a raw black and white command terminal. 30 seconds. Arthur typed furiously, bypassing the primary nodes, slicing through the panicked security protocols the IT team had tripped. 20 seconds. "What is he doing?" Benjamin Croft gasped, watching the terminal. "He's shutting down the cooling systems. He's going to fry the servers." "I'm starving the logic bomb of memory," Arthur stated coldly, not taking his eyes off the screen. "It feeds on processing power. I'm putting the servers to sleep." 10 seconds. Arthur hit a final string of commands, inputting a specific string of code he hadn't used in 4 years. Harper, 412, override. He slammed the enter key. 5 seconds. The entire nerve center plunged into pitch darkness. The sirens died. The screens went completely black. The silence in the room was deafening. No one breathed. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides. Richard Hayes looked visibly triumphant, ready to gloat that the beggar had destroyed the company. For 5 agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then, the soft hum of the servers rebooted. The ambient lights flickered back to a calm, soothing blue. The massive wall screen snapped back to life, glowing with a brilliant, healthy green. A digital chime echoed through the room. Omnicorp acquisition. Transfer complete. Escrow secured. The room erupted. Engineers cheered, some collapsing into their chairs, others hugging. Benjamin Croft let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Arthur slowly pushed his chair back from the terminal. He let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline suddenly draining from his body, leaving him exhausted. He stood up, smoothed down his cheap, frayed jacket, and turned to walk out. He didn't make it to the door. Victoria Sterling was blocking his path. The billionaire CEO looked at the main screen, then down at the terminal, and finally up at Arthur. The ice in her eyes was gone, replaced by a burning, intense curiosity. "What did you say your name was?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying across the room. "Arthur. Arthur Pendleton." Victoria turned her head slightly to glare at Richard Hayes, who was suddenly looking very pale. "Richard, why was the man who just saved my $2 billion merger walking out of my lobby with a briefcase?" Part 3. The autopsy of a sabotage. The silence that followed Victoria Sterling's question was heavy enough to crack the marble floor. Richard Hayes, a man who usually wielded his authority like a blunt instrument, suddenly looked incredibly small. His tailored Italian suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame as he stammered, "Victoria, I—" The applicant's work history was highly irregular. A 3-year gap. Company policy clearly states— Company policy, Victoria interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. Just cost me 10 years off my life and nearly cost this firm $2 billion. Bring him upstairs. Now. 10 minutes later, Arthur found himself sitting in the zenith of corporate power. Victoria's penthouse office was a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the sprawling metropolis. There were no frayed edges here, no thrift store compromises. It was a room built for conquerors. Arthur sat rigidly on a white leather sofa, his scuffed briefcase resting by his worn shoes. Across from him, Victoria poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from a crystal decanter. She handed one to Arthur and took the leather chair opposite him. Benjamin Croft, the CTO, stood nervously by the window, while Richard Hayes hovered near the door like a chastised schoolboy. "Let's skip the corporate pleasantries, Mr. Pendleton," Victoria said, crossing her legs, her sharp, calculating eyes locked onto him. "You just bypassed a military-grade encryption lockdown in under a minute using a ghost protocol my own IT department didn't know existed. You claim you built it. I want the truth, and I want it now. If you planted that logic bomb to extort us, the police are waiting downstairs." Arthur met her gaze without flinching. "I didn't plant a bomb, Miss Sterling. I built a fire door. 4 years ago, I took a blind freelance contract through a third-party vendor called Apex Solutions. The parameters were highly specific. Build an asynchronous fail-safe loop that could isolate a Unix-based mainframe in the event of a catastrophic core corruption." Benjamin Croft scoffed loudly from the window, wiping his brow. "That's absurd. Sterling Enterprises has never done business with a vendor called Apex Solutions. We build everything in-house." "He's lying to cover his tracks, Victoria. He hacked us." Arthur turned his head slowly to look at the CTO. "If I wanted to hack you, Benjamin, I wouldn't have targeted your front-facing UI. I would have bled your DNS servers dry while you were sleeping. I built the Titan protocol to save the system, not destroy it. But someone took my fire door, weaponized the code, and attached it to a logic bomb designed to trigger the moment the Omnicorp escrow initiated." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Why would you take a blind contract from a shadowy vendor? A man of your apparent skill level should have been working at a top-tier firm." Arthur looked down at his calloused hands. The anger and the adrenaline were fading, leaving behind the raw, exhausting reality of his life. "Because top-tier firms don't let you work from a pediatric oncology ward," Arthur said quietly. The room went completely still. Richard looked away, suddenly finding the doorframe fascinating. "My daughter, Harper, was diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disease 3 years ago," Arthur continued, his voice steady but laced with a profound, quiet grief. "She needed round-the-clock care, specialized treatments, and chemotherapy. I had to quit my position as a lead architect. The medical bills wiped out my savings in 6 months. Apex Solutions offered me $100,000 in untraceable cash to write the code remotely. No questions asked. I didn't care who they were or what they were doing. It paid for Harper's treatments. She went into remission last month." He looked up, locking eyes with Victoria. "I came here today begging for a job because I need the health insurance to keep her alive. Your VP of Talent Acquisition told me my daughter's survival was a liability and threw me out." Victoria slowly turned her head toward Richard Hayes. The look on her face was one of absolute, terrifying disgust. "Is that true, Richard? You dismissed a master-level systems architect because he took time off to save his dying child?" "Victoria, the resume was a massive red flag," Richard pleaded, stepping forward. "We need dedicated." "Shut your mouth!" Victoria snapped, the command echoing off the glass walls. She turned back to Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton, if what you are saying is true, it means someone inside this building hired Apex Solutions to build that back door and then modified it to tank the Omnicorp merger today." Arthur nodded. "Exactly. It was an inside job." "Can you prove it?" she asked. Arthur looked at the sleek laptop sitting on Victoria's desk. "Give me access to the root directory logs. The logic bomb had a deployment signature. Code leaves fingerprints. Miss Sterling. Whoever armed the bomb left a trace." Victoria pushed her personal laptop across the desk. "Do it." "Victoria, wait!" Benjamin Croft interjected, stepping away from the window, his face flushed. You can't let an unvetted outsider access the root logs. That violates every security protocol we have. The Omnicorp auditors will have our heads. Benjamin, Victoria said coldly, the Omnicorp auditors are currently celebrating a successful merger because of this unvetted outsider. Sit down. Arthur pulled the laptop onto his lap. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second, feeling the familiar, comforting logic of the machine. Then he went to work. He bypassed the standard operating system entirely, pulling up the raw command terminal. The screen reflected in his eyes as lines of green text cascaded down the black background. The logic bomb was dormant, Arthur explained as he typed, his voice shifting into a clinical, professional cadence. It was waiting for a specific trigger. The trigger was the escrow wire transfer. But to embed a sleeper program that deep into the legacy mainframe, the saboteur needed executive-level administrative credentials. A board member? Victoria asked, her posture rigid. Or a C-level executive, Arthur replied. He ran a decryption algorithm against the deployment log. I'm isolating the timestamp of the bomb's integration. It wasn't planted 3 years ago when I wrote the code. It was planted exactly 48 hours ago, right before the merger was finalized. Benjamin Croft swallowed audibly. He took a step toward the door. I need to go check on the IT team. Make sure the servers are fully stabilized. Stay exactly where you are, Ben, Victoria ordered, not taking her eyes off the screen. I've got the internal IP address, Arthur announced. The rapid clicking of the keys stopped. He hit enter one last time. A single line of text remained isolated on the screen. He turned the laptop around to face Victoria. The credentials used to authorize the logic bomb belong to the Chief Technology Officer, Arthur said softly. The IP address matches the private terminal in Benjamin Croft's office. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Victoria stared at the screen, then slowly stood up. She walked around the desk, her heels clicking methodically on the hardwood floor until she was standing inches away from her CTO. Ben, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, you have been with this company for 8 years. You championed the Omnicorp merger. It's a setup! Benjamin shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. He framed me! He wrote the code, he triggered it, and now he's manipulating the logs to make himself look like a hero. Victoria, you can't believe this tramp over me. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He simply turned the laptop back around and tapped the screen. I also pulled the secondary directory. The logic bomb was designed to do more than just stop the merger. While the system was locked down, it was initiating a localized data wipe in the legacy accounting servers. Specifically, the server farms covering hardware procurement for the last 3 fiscal years. Victoria's eyes widened in realization. She looked at Benjamin, who was now visibly shaking. The Omnicorp audit, Victoria breathed. Omnicorp's forensic accountants were scheduled to take over the procurement servers tomorrow morning. She stepped closer to Benjamin. What did you do, Ben? How much did you steal? Benjamin backed into the glass wall, looking trapped. Victoria, please. The hardware budgets, they were bloated anyway. I just skimmed the overflow. It was a victimless. He choked on his words, realizing he had just confessed. How much? Victoria demanded, her voice echoing like a gunshot. Benjamin closed his eyes. 40 million. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the office. The golden boy of Sterling Enterprises, the man who commanded a multi-million-dollar salary, had tried to destroy a $2 billion merger just to cover up his own embezzlement. He had hired Apex Solutions years ago to build a backdoor, keeping it in his back pocket, and then weaponized Arthur's code when the walls started closing in. Victoria walked over to her desk and pressed a button on her intercom. Security. I need a full team in my office. Contact the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI and have them meet us in the lobby. Benjamin sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. Victoria then turned her attention to Richard Hayes, who was pressed against the doorframe, trying to make himself invisible. Richard, Victoria said, her tone devoid of any warmth, you dismissed the man who wrote the architecture of our fail-safes. You failed to recognize world-class talent because you were too busy judging a gap on a piece of paper. You lack vision, you lack empathy, and you lack competence. Victoria, I was just following standard HR parameters. You're fired, she stated simply. Clear out your desk. If you aren't out of the building in 15 minutes, security will throw you out exactly like you tried to throw Arthur out. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the look in the billionaire's eyes told him his corporate life was entirely over. He turned and fled the office without a word. As the security team rushed in to haul away a sobbing Benjamin Croft, Victoria Sterling walked back over to the white leather sofa. She looked down at Arthur Pendleton, the single father in the frayed suit, who was quietly packing his grandfather's watch back into his worn briefcase. "Arthur," Victoria said, her voice softer than it had been all day. He looked up. "Do you have a few more minutes?" she asked. "I think we need to negotiate a new contract." Victoria Sterling did not sit back behind her massive mahogany desk. Instead, she remained on the white leather sofa opposite Arthur, stripping away the physical barriers of corporate hierarchy. The room was still vibrating with the aftershocks of Benjamin Croft's spectacular downfall and subsequent arrest, but Victoria's focus was entirely on the quiet, unassuming man in the frayed charcoal suit. "The senior systems architect position you applied for pays $140,000 a year," Victoria began, her voice steady and echoing slightly in the vast penthouse. "It comes with standard health benefits, 2 weeks of vacation, and a reporting structure that would have buried you under 3 layers of middle management." Arthur sat quietly, his hands resting on his scuffed briefcase. He didn't interrupt. He knew how this game was played, even if he hadn't sat at a table like this in over 3 years. "Given what I have just witnessed," Victoria continued, leaning forward, "putting you in that role would be an insult to your intellect and a massive liability to my company. You understand the foundational architecture of this firm better than the man I was paying 7 figures to run it. Benjamin's betrayal has left a massive crater in our infrastructure. The Omnicorp integration begins on Monday, and my entire C-suite is currently bleeding from a self-inflicted wound." She paused, pouring herself another glass of sparkling water, though she didn't drink it. "I don't need a senior architect, Arthur. I need a chief information security officer, someone who answers to absolutely no one but me. Someone who knows how to build fire doors and, more importantly, knows how the people trying to burn the building down think." Arthur looked at the sweeping view of the city skyline through the glass. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the metropolis. "You're offering a C-level executive position to a man who walked into your lobby with a 3-year employment gap and a thrift store suit. I am offering a C-level executive position to the man who saved my legacy," Victoria corrected sharply. "I don't care about the gap on your resume, Arthur. I care about the fact that when the sky was falling, you were the only person in the building who didn't look up and scream. The salary is $800,000 a year, with a heavily weighted equity package that vests post-merger. But I imagine the money isn't the primary negotiation point for you." "It's not," Arthur said softly. He finally let go of his briefcase and leaned forward, his posture shifting from a desperate applicant to a peer. "My daughter, Harper, is treated at the Johns Hopkins Children's Center in Baltimore. She has a team of 4 specialists. She is in remission, but the protocol requires experimental immunosuppressants that most insurance providers classify as elective or non-formulary. They cost $12,000 a month out of pocket. I also have nearly $400,000 in outstanding medical debt." Victoria didn't blink. "Sterling Enterprises is entirely self-insured for our executive tier. If you sign the contract, Harper will be moved to our Platinum Plus tier by midnight. Every specialist, every experimental drug, every helicopter transport she might ever need will be covered 100%. As for the debt, I will authorize a $500,000 signing bonus, wired to your account by tomorrow morning. You can pay off the hospital, burn the receipts, and start fresh." Arthur felt a physical weight, one he had carried for over 1,000 agonizing days, suddenly lift from his chest. It was so abrupt, so entirely overwhelming, that he had to look away for a moment to hide the sudden moisture in his eyes. He had spent 3 years drowning, fighting for every single breath, and suddenly he had been pulled onto the shore. "There is one more condition," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, but his resolve absolute. "I will rebuild your security grid. I will integrate the Omnicorp mainframe, and I will make your servers bulletproof. I will work 80-hour weeks, if that is what the code requires. But if the hospital calls, if Harper spikes a fever, if her blood panels drop, if she simply needs her father, I drop everything. I walk out of the room, whether it's a Tuesday afternoon or the middle of a board meeting, and I don't come back until she is safe. Full remote capability, no questions asked, no approvals needed. Victoria extended her hand across the glass coffee table. You proved today that you can save this company from a hospital room if you have to, Arthur. You have a deal. Arthur looked at her hand, a symbol of a new life, and took it. Her grip was firm, matching his own. An hour later, Arthur walked out of the gleaming glass doors of Sterling Enterprises. The security guard who had tried to tackle him earlier practically saluted him as he passed. The evening air of the city hit his face, cool and sharp. He didn't hail one of the black town cars waiting by the curb. Instead, he walked down the block and descended the concrete stairs into the subway station. The ride back to his neighborhood in Queens felt surreal. The rhythmic clacking of the train cars over the tracks was the same sound he had heard that morning when he was planning how to pawn his grandfather's watch. Now, that sound felt like a victory march. He climbed the stairs of his pre-war apartment building, the familiar smell of boiled cabbage and old floor wax greeting him in the hallway. He unlocked the door to his drafty, one-bedroom apartment. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly woman from down the hall who watched Harper for a few dollars an hour, was asleep in the armchair by the television. In the corner of the small living room, a makeshift bed was set up, surrounded by air purifiers and a basket of plastic medical vials. Arthur quietly woke Mrs. Higgins, pressing a $50 bill into her hand, the last of his physical cash, and thanked her. Once she had shuffled out, Arthur walked over to the bed. Harper was sleeping soundly, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Her pale blonde hair, finally growing back after the grueling rounds of chemotherapy, fanned out across the pillow. Arthur knelt beside the bed, carefully setting his battered briefcase on the floor. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. She stirred, her blue eyes fluttering open. She blinked sleepily at him, a small smile spreading across her tired face. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Did you get the job?" Arthur felt a tear finally break free, tracing a hot path down his cheek. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, pulling the blankets up snugly around her shoulders. "I did, sweetheart," Arthur whispered back, his voice trembling with a joy he hadn't known in years. "I got the job. We're going to be okay now. Daddy fixed the system, and the system is going to take care of us." 6 months later, the landscape of Sterling Enterprises had fundamentally changed. The Omnicorp merger was a historic success, largely due to the flawless, impenetrable back-end architecture designed by the new Chief Information Security Officer. Arthur Pendleton no longer wore thrift store suits. He stood in his custom-built corner office on the 60th floor, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blazer. The office didn't smell of cold ambition. It smelled of fresh coffee and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla cookies Harper loved. Behind his desk, a massive, state-of-the-art multi-monitor setup hummed with quiet power, displaying the global health of the company's data streams. It was all green, no red, no logic bombs. Just absolute, unbreakable order. The door to his office chimed, and before he could answer, it swung open. Harper, her cheeks flushed with healthy color and her hair tied in a bright yellow ribbon, ran into the room. She was followed closely by Victoria Sterling, who was carrying a small stack of briefing folders. "She bypassed my assistant," Victoria said, a rare, genuine smile softening her usually sharp features. "Apparently, the chief architect's daughter has absolute clearance." Arthur laughed, scooping Harper up into his arms and spinning her around. The sound of her pure, unburdened laughter echoed off the glass walls, a sound far more beautiful than any successful compiling code or soaring stock price. He looked at Victoria over his daughter's shoulder. The billionaire CEO nodded respectfully. They had built an empire together out of the ashes of a crisis, but they both knew the real victory wasn't the billions of dollars secured in the escrow accounts. The real victory was the little girl laughing in the corner office, safe, healthy, and deeply loved. Arthur set Harper down and walked over to his monitors. He tapped the glass lightly. The system was running perfectly. He had built the fail-safes, he had weathered the storm, and finally, after years of standing in the dark, Arthur Pendleton had written a program for a beautiful life. Arthur's journey from a desperate, dismissed applicant to the savior of a billionaire's empire proves that true brilliance cannot be erased by a gap on a resume. Driven by a father's relentless love, he turned corporate sabotage into his ultimate redemption. In the end, Arthur didn't just rewrite the security code of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, he successfully rewrote the future for himself and his daughter.